It's the week ending Saturday, the 11th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped, brought to you by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen England cricketer Ben Stokes on trial in Bristol, earthquakes in Indonesia killing hundreds, and President Donald Trump potentially incriminating his own son in another late-night Twitter rant. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Timson, Hollie Clemence and Kari Wilkin. And Kari, you're starting the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
I think this is the week we ask, could China's drug scandals bode ill for all of us?
I guess the biggest challenge right now in public health, in terms of public health concern, is the public concern or the public confidence in vaccination. And that is definitely a horrible opportunity missed. If people, because of this horrible commercial practice, affect the hard work which the government, the society has been building for their confidence in vaccination.
Emily Chan, director of the CHUK Centre for Human Health, speaking to CNN in July. Kari, what horrible commercial practice is she talking about?
Right, this is the latest of a series of vaccine scandals that have erupted in China, but this has really outraged the public. There's actually been days of protests outside government offices recently in Beijing, which obviously in China is very unusual.
And this is based on fact? This isn't another conspiracy, right? Because
apparently this is based on fact, okay. Yes, as far as...
Because you hear vaccines and outrage, and,
yes,
I'm trying to steer us away from conspiracies again.
The government announced last month that more than 250,000 substandard DPT vaccines, that's diphtheria, whooping cough and tetanus, so obviously going to children, had been sold in China and presumably used on children. This obviously created mass panic. Senior executives have been arrested at the pharmaceutical company that produced the vaccines, Changxian Biotech. This comes weeks after the European Medicines Agency and the US Food and Drug Administration issued alerts about a cancer-causing ingredient in a blood pressure medication supplied by a Chinese company, which resulted in major recalls. So this is all fairly disastrous for the public face of Chinese pharmaceuticals.
And disastrous as well, Jamie, clearly, for the companies involved. So, I mean, mistakes do happen. Is there really a pivotal turning point in this news story?
I think the turning point at the moment, I think, is effect that it'll have on Xi Jinping's grip on power. So he's recently been through a power grab, as we've talked about on this podcast before, and the problems have generally been contained within China. A lot of the ways that he tends to kind of hammer down on protests and stuff is to silence dissidents. And now, because of the effects on the European Medicine Agency and the FDA, this is something that he can no longer control. It's gone out of China. It's affected the global supply chain and people are in trouble. And I think it's not the first time. And I think that's quite a big issue. You know, it's almost 10 years to the day from the infant milk tragedy in China. And there's been a move away, hopefully from Xi Jinping, a move away from getting rid of this kind of made in China issue, where people always used to think, oh, made in China, it's bad quality, you know, they've mass produced it. And there's been a real push by the government to try and make China a bit more of a kind of global standard of kind of certainty and assurance.
So do you agree, Kari, if this didn't affect medicines that we were consuming in the West or potentially affect them, then actually they could have kept a lid on this story?
I don't think they could. I think there's such outrage. I think particularly possibly because children are involved, that it's they can't quell the public voices of dissent. There's been a huge protest online, you know, hashtags referring to the scandals are getting tens of millions of views within days of being posted. So this has gone beyond. This is not containable anymore.
And to be clear for anyone listening to this who is worried, does this affect medicines in the West?
Yeah, I think that's the other big issue. It highlights the global risks posed to the pharmaceuticals chain internationally, posed by the weak oversight in China. And it's highlighted how poorly Chinese manufacturers are regulated. In fact, Chinese domestic regulators, they're not actually required to inspect the companies that produce solely for export. That falls on the people that are importing these ingredients.
Holly, that's a staggering fact, isn't it?
It is. It's quite surprising, isn't it? But it also means, I guess, the US Food and Drug Administration and the European Medicines Agency, which are responsible for checking out those manufacturers, need to step up their game and make sure that the countries that they're representing are protected. I do think it resonates for people around the world who have just had their children vaccinated. The thought in the UK, if the NHS turned around and said, oh, actually, you've just vaccinated your 3-month baby, but we don't know what we've put inside your baby's body. It's shocking.
I think that makes it so much more relatable. People, when you hear about these things abroad, it's very hard to relate. But when they sort of go, oh, well, actually, these vaccines have come over here too, you suddenly go, oh, that could be my child. And given that China accounts for 40% of global production of these ingredients. So effectively 40% of the ingredients in our drugs could be coming from China without any proper checks on them.
But Holly, what's the solution though? Because, there may not be enough people checking the drugs and that might be shocking. But actually, unless someone literally opened every single vial and looked in it, you have to rely on reputational damage for the companies involved, which is happening, and trust. Basically, just like we do with food imports. That's the only way to do it.
There's also fears that there's not enough people that go around doing these checks, that they're given pre-warning to do the checks so Chinese manufacturers could cover up something potentially. There are also rumours of bribes. There are actual problems. It's not just kind of accidents.
I think the main problem, though, is that globalisation is like de facto deregulation. If we are to accept a globalised world where we're taking vaccines and pharmaceutical active ingredients and taking them and using them in the UK, we have to accept that we're not going to be able to put as much stringent checks, and you have to trust them. And now China has had a history of not being very trustworthy. There was an example that I think Quartz quoted of a guy who was obviously anonymous, but he was saying that it's not just the pharmaceutical industry, but it's a common problem in China. The idea of running a business with honesty hardly exists. Lots of industries are using loopholes, taking risks for profits, because the costs of committing a crime are so low. Obviously, it's Pandora's box. We can't stop globalization from happening, but maybe we stop importing from China as much as we do.
Well, I suppose what you can stop, Kari, is the race to the bottom price-wise, isn't it? So you can say, as you might do as a personal household, you might say, I'm going to buy a German car because I'm going to put my family in it and I trust the way the Germans build cars more than I would whichever other country. Yeah. People make those kinds of decisions all the time. And yet when it comes to the NHS, for example, when they're saving money by buying vaccines from China, the general view of the general public would be, get them as cheaply as possible without thought.
Critics do say that cost-cutting by the drug industry is a major culprit for these lowered standards. But realistically, this is industry. Companies are always going to try and be competitive with prices, and that's what consumers ultimately want. I think we need more global consensus in terms of how drugs industries are regulated if they're going to be distributed. And in fact, China last year became the 8th member of the ICH, the Global Drug Standards Body. So it's a step in the right direction. But I think we also do just need, if we're going to import drugs, then we do need more oversight by overseas agencies of producers in China. Like, as Holly was saying, the FDA has 22 employees in China, overseeing a total of around 700 facilities that supply to the US. And to put that in perspective, last year alone, China exported $29 billion worth of ingredients for drugs. 22 people are overseeing that.
And what about the response in China? As Emily Chan was saying in that clip we played from CNN, essentially their approach to this vaccine scandal is, in a very typically Chinese governmental way, basically to shut down discussion of the issue. But in this instance, that's because there is a public safety argument there, isn't there? Which is, let's not get hysterical. The chances you've been affected by this are small, so it's better not everybody knows about it.
I think they've reacted quicker than they did with the infant milk issue 10 years ago. And I guess this is the turning point now. What they do next, the Chinese government, will completely affect how the world sees their pharma industry. Either they'll crack down on it, which maybe they'll crack down a little bit too far, but that will give the rest of the world a chance to give them a second chance.
OK, Holly, you're up next this week. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Are political activists the new football hoodlums?
Sounds of a far-right protest taking place at Bookmark's bookshop in London. Holly, what was that?
So this week, like you say, there was a protest of a dozen mask-wearing fascists, as described by the bookshop itself, trying to intimidate staff and destroy books.
I mean, it's a terrifying prospect. I must say, even just hearing the clip, it was rather underwhelming in reality, wasn't it?
You could say that. If you were staff, I imagine it would have been
Absolutely.
quite scary.
Yeah, sure. I'm just reassuring listeners who may not have been aware of the story that, books weren't burned and shops didn't fall to the ground. It was just a load of idiots ransacking a bookshop in a very tepid way.
And then a few days later, it emerged that Jacob Rees-Mogg had had his home vandalised while he was on holiday, described as hoodlum by the Evening Standard. They sprayed posh scum, sharpened dye on his property and left a sex toy on his car and condoms strewn around his garden. This prompted Sean O'Grady in The Independent to suggest that there's a generalised increase in low-level political violence, which is set to become the new normal.
And is there?
It's obviously difficult to quantify it right now because it's happening, but there's lots of reasons why it might be happening and lots of reasons why we maybe should be aware of it. There's obviously the social media aspect. There was a New York Times article just yesterday looking at the impact of Facebook on developing countries, such as fake reports of sectarian violence in India that set off riots and killed several people and displaced thousands. They're saying this is coming to America now. It kind of ties in with the censorship of Alex Jones and Tommy Robinson. Should Facebook and Twitter be more careful about what they're letting happen on their sites?
Yeah, because the thing is, Jamie, it might be that this sort of protest or direct action, whatever you want to call it, has actually been happening for the last, 40, 50 years. But the general public weren't exposed to it because the mainstream media didn't report it, because it wasn't a big deal, because a protest like that is underwhelming. It would be on the local news, it would be in your local newspaper. But now, if you daub graffiti on an MP's house, instead of that just being in the local paper, it's all over social media and gets shared with people who think it's a good idea.
I think the two incidences that you highlight are actually quite separate. And I think part of the reason is that Jacob Rees-Mogg is a public figure and is an MP. And while he is not at all, does not deserve to be vandalised or to have dildos on his car, the difference between that and 12, so it turns out that they were actually UKIP party members. 3 of them have been suspended from the party this week for the actions, going in and attacking civilians, effectively. I know not to use army terminology, but they are actually citizens and causing and intimidating and causing unrest. One is a fight against power, one is punching up, and the other one is punching down, or at least punching sideways. And if we look at what's happened with UKIP most recently, UKIP has increased its membership by 3,000 members since the Chequers deal. And it looks like that is highly linked to their introduction of alt-right YouTube stars such as Paul Joseph Watson, who has links with Breitbart and Alex Jones, as well as some other ones. And they have been basically riling up membership of UKIP and enticing people to become a part of the party through their YouTube channels and stuff.
Okay, fine. That's a point worth making. But the reason the two cases are being linked together is my question. That what's similar is that they're both making an impact on social media, and that's why they're happening.
Yes, yeah, and I think that social media is making society more unstable, because if you hear about something and then you see a backlash, and it's all happening within 5 or 10 minutes, you see something that's happened that you might not have been aware of before, you see someone attacking it back, and you go, look at the thing about the burqa this week, so many people I've heard, Boris Johnson's comments about the burqa, so many people this week I've heard have incredibly nuanced arguments suddenly about the burqa that they would have never had 5 years ago. And it's because of what social media is highlighting. And it's certainly because they are no longer engaging with each other, but they're engaging with themselves.
While social media and that it can sort of, you can argue that it's increasing these personal attacks, I think, on politicians, as Jamie was saying, that's always happened. It's always been a case. I think it is more these sort of this much less directionless violence. I think that's the new thing here. I do think we need to be careful that coverage on social media doesn't over-magnify, because while at the same time, while you can argue that it's causing this sort of violence, it's also making us more aware of it. So I think we should be careful to put too much emphasis on how much it's spreading or not.
I would disagree on the politician side of it. I get Jamie's point about punching upwards, but it's also part of democracy that we've all got the opportunity to maybe become an MP, and that would personally put me off wanting to become a politician, having seen what happened at the last year's election. Dozens of MPs said it was the worst election they'd experienced in terms of violence. They suffered personal abuse. One MP had a bottle smashed on him. There's been death threats. I think it has got
whatever
worse.
you think about Jacob Rees-Mogg, I mean, he he clearly believes what he thinks and he's just saying what he believes and he has a constituency and that's his right to be elected, isn't it?
Completely. And I probably disagree with him on everything he believes in, but I would not want to have 6 children come home from holiday to find that on my house.
Or to be verbally abused by students as he was at a university event in Bristol in February. It's this sort of shouting down of dissenting voices. It's a bit worrying.
Like, it's about like letting people see that there is a kind of an open access to the media and allowing people with viewpoints and strong viewpoints a voice and a platform to engage with them.
But we're not a healthier society, are we? That's what I'm getting at. We've allowed everyone a voice and it feels like a much more toxic society than before.
But we haven't, because what we've done is we've divided between everyone shouting to each other on social media and then given like a certain band of people this idea of being like, well, if you write for The Guardian or if you write for The Independent or if you write for The Telegraph, then you've suddenly, your opinion is worth more than everyone else's.
People aren't smashing up a bookshop because Afua Hirsch has a blue tick.
Why do you think people are smashing up a bookshop then?
And most people aren't smashing up bookshops.
No, sure.
I
didn't say most people. I said these people. Well, I think because they've been given a voice, because it's so easy now for them to find a community of like-minded others who don't actually need to engage with anything else. That's why.
I wonder in politics if there's a lack of middle ground at the moment, which is partly at fault in we've got Leavers, Remainers, Brexiteers, you've got labels for everyone. Labour's gone very left and the Tories are kind of edging towards people like Rees-Mogg. Maybe people in the middle ground have gone a bit quiet because there's no one representing them and it has become an extremist situation.
The votes, the recent votes, have given kind of fillip to the people on the fringes of thinking, yeah, there are other people around me that think this way. You know, you only have to look at what's happened in Italy or, you know, what's happened, you know, with I guess I hated to put Donald Trump and those all together, but there is that feeling of like, hey, there are some like-minded people, and yes, and I have strong opinions, and now I can continually talk to each other, and it's legitimised it, yeah.
Maybe we need to more loudly challenge fake news, for example. This is a major factor in all this. We need, rather than just sort of saying, well, just ignore it. You know, this came up recently on a podcast about QAnon, about whether, you know, should you just ignore it or should you actually publicise it and challenge it? And I think we do. We need to, rather than just keep going, this is crazy, just ignore it. Maybe we need to go, okay, here's your theory. This is why it's ridiculous, and actually challenge it.
You know, I think if someone is shouting their opinion or is angry about something and you try and hit them with fire, with facts back, they're only going to end up more stubborn. What we need is kind of more conversations that have less of a kind of adversarial and more of a community-driven, more of a how do we make things move forward.
Yeah, well, you would say that, wouldn't you, you idiot? Jamie, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
Was this the week we wanted a little more conversation and a little less action, please?
We're trying to do 3 things with the Citizens' Assembly. The first is that we want to understand public opinion on Brexit better. We've got opinion polls, but we don't have much sense of what people think when they've really had the chance to learn about the issues and think about them. The second aim is that we want informed public opinion to influence the Brexit process itself. And we'll be working really hard to make sure that politicians and the media know what the people in the Assembly have said and what they've concluded. The third aim is that we want to understand better how this kind of democratic process works. This is a good way of doing democracy, and hopefully we'll learn about how to do this kind of deliberative exercise better in the future.
Dr. Alan Rennick, Director of the Citizens' Assembly on Brexit, speaking back in 2017. Jamie, deliberative democracy. What's that?
So, the idea is there is a problem with democracy at the moment. Now, the idea of it would be, and it takes lots of different forms, but generally the core idea is the same, is that you get a representative sample of the population, and then you get them to deliberate with guidance, obviously, on issues. And so famously it's been
like
used,
a focus group, basically.
Yeah, but for like policy. So famously it's been
wasn't
used,
the Labour Party criticised for governing by focus group?
So famously, if you let me finish, it's been used in Ireland recently to ascertain the perfect question for the abortion referendum. And it was used to great success. People were very happy because they got 100 people together. It was over the course of 6 weeks. They gave them an all-expert opinion, and a judge who was coming to terms with it said that they had probably the most nuanced view of abortion in that country as any other group.
But this was just to form the question that was on the referendum paper?
Yeah, so because there were lots of different questions.
So how's that different to a focus group?
it's like a wider focus. I'm not arguing with you that it's not a focus group,
Right,
except that it takes, rather than focus groups just taking from a very specific like sample, it's taking like a much wider sample. So I'll give you another example of how it's been used. I don't understand why you have such an issue with this. It seems ridiculous.
I'm asking you what it is.
In South Korea, the new government of President Moon Jae-in has faced the difficult choice of whether to resume or abandon the construction of 2 nuclear reactors. Now, his government didn't want to resume it. They wanted to abandon it. But he gave it out to this citizens' jury who deliberated on it from an example of representation, and they went against his decision. They asked him to resume the nuclear reactor.
Okay, and is that binding then?
Well, no. So the government then decides, but it has been binding in every other situation.
No, because the only reason I'm going on about this is if it isn't binding, then it's just a focus group, it seems to me.
Yeah.
I think one difference that the Centre for Deliberative Democracy would argue that it's not a focus group is that they inform them. They have an advisory committee representing different points of view on an issue. So they take the survey at the beginning, they'll spend a weekend with people, letting them ask questions, looking at like packages of information, and then ask them again at the end.
It's educational.
But it's a jury, except it's not necessarily binding.
Yeah, it's basically a jury for government
or
policy.
the House of Lords, if you look at the English system, essentially, right?
Yes, I guess, except that the House of Lords is in no way representative of the whole country.
Okay, right.
More like a jury.
Fine. Okay, so I think we kind of know what deliberative democracy is. Why are we talking about it?
So this week, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal talking about how the examples of it have proven that they are getting to a stage where it looks like it will be used as a form of democracy further across the kind of Western world and generally in many different governments.
Righto. So should we do it here, Kari?
Well, it's already been used, I understand, over the past 3 decades in a total of almost 30 countries. So I'd be interested to see what the results are. I think there's a lot to be said for it. It gives the wider populace a voice. It's an alternative, as Jamie was saying, to democratic institutions at a time when approval rates are falling massively for those institutions. I'm not sure it's necessarily a solution, but it could certainly be a starting point for reform.
It's all very consensual, though, isn't it? I mean, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying it doesn't quite chime with the political mood in the West at the moment. The people who like Trump like him because he said, this is what I'll do, and that's what he's tried to do. The idea that you then say, here's a group of 100 citizens, and I might end up doing a complete U-turn because they think it's a bad idea, might be the right thing for the country, but it's not why people vote for politicians now.
I think if the idea would be that it would delineate down from the federal, so it wouldn't be 100 people, it would be regional based, so you would have deliberative democracies in your own communities. I think then you're probably looking at a way of changing people's opinions, and they'll be like, well, actually, I know this guy, and I understand why he thinks differently to me, and that then may mean that you'll be challenging your opinions further. There was that, willing to listen. There was those great studies that came out when they were doing referendums on different things, and people who had spoken to someone of a different, I think it was on gay marriage, and so people that had spoken to someone who was gay or had a far greater want or desire to get involved in the argument once they knew someone who had been affected by the issues. And so I think that's a way that it'll work, generally moving away from, as I was saying earlier, adversarial. But there, of course, are critics, and there is a question about whether it's irresponsible to give over this much power to people. What we have learned from the referendum debate is that direct democracy has really bloody messed things up for us. And so whether or not we should actually live in a country where people get to decide is a question that I think we have to deal with.
Well, it's arguably messed things up because the public seem to have a different view to the political class, and yet have elected those politicians twice now who have that different view. I mean, that's the complication. So that would be amplified, wouldn't it? That's what I'm getting at.
But did the Brexit vote, did that not go so, in my view, disastrously wrong because the public wasn't properly educated beforehand, because the information that was being channeled through wasn't reasoned and unbiased, and because a lot of people would have just tuned it out and wouldn't actually have spent time thinking about it, because who's got time to wade through all these arguments?
But in the system that we have, where we already have an elected chamber and an unelected House of Lords on top, and then the royals as well, is this necessary?
My question would be about bias. If you've just got one polling company in charge of asking
choosing?
people who they're choosing. I don't have a weekend spare to just sit around and talk about whether I want.
But the point
something
is,
like
is
Brexit.
that we all involve ourselves in juries, don't we? So if we saw it
have
as
to be compulsory.
yeah. So if we saw it as something that we had to do,
Citizens'
as a duty,
responsibility.
yeah.
And with regards to juries, I don't know if any of you guys have ever actually sat on one. No?
No.
No? Jamie?
No, I would love to.
Yeah, that's very much why you should never be allowed. But the people that I know that have say that it is a mixed experience. It doesn't necessarily enhance their faith in the legal process. When you sit down with a representative sample of normal people, you think, God, is this how things are actually done?
And I think that's the point, is that actually we'll probably get to a situation that a lot of people will be like, oh, God. But if it's compulsory and it involves education and informing, actually we'll move forward as a country together.
I mean, this originated in ancient Greece, didn't it, where decision-making
What, this
was
podcast? I didn't realise we were going that long.
I know, who knew? Where decision-making was carried out by large gatherings of citizens and largely without the aid of representatives, and it seemed to work out quite well for them.
I think listening to what people talk about it, and when people are talking about it, it's much more collaborative, it's much more evidence-based than we've had debates in the past, because people are listening to experts and they're moving forward. And if you're forced to be there, this is my same argument about compulsory voting, if you're forced to be there, at some point you're going to start listening to the points and you're going to start playing along.
And it might also make other people more willing to learn about things, because it's one thing to sort of go, oh God, there's this policy and MPs are going to debate it and I really can't be bothered. But if you know that a group of your peers are debating it and then you want to see what the outcome of that debate is going to be, you're more likely yourself to then actually get educated about it, and perhaps it can spread that knowledge a little further.
But, Holly, it's not going to come here, is it?
I don't think it's going to be replacing government anytime soon. It has come to London already. They did it.
Has it?
In 2010, they did a study. They took people for a weekend and talked about national ID cards and the way we vote. Lots of it. They looked at 29 different issues.
That's a focus group, I'm telling you.
But what happened from it, I don't...
You know what? I like focus groups.
Well, on that bombshell, my thanks to the Euripides, Aristophanes and Sophocles of this podcast, Jamie Timson, Hollie Clemence and Kari Wilkin. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. Continue the debate, it says here, at Week Unwrapped on Twitter. And if you really like the show, then do write us a review on Apple Podcasts. That really helps other people find the show and pushes us up those charts. Stay subscribed to hear Business Unwrapped, which will be dropping onto your feed imminently. That's our series of bonus stories brought to you by our friends at Barclays Corporate Banking. And if you're not subscribed to the show, do it now. Search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.